Welcome, everyone. We'll give people a few minutes to come into the room before we get started with our Trade Policy Research Forum July webinar. We've got a great webinar today, but before I hand over to Michael Ferrantino, one of our advisors, to introduce the topic and talk about the speaker, I just wanted to say a few words about the Trade Policy Research Forum itself. My name is Ben Shepherd. I'm co-founder with Hannah Norberg, who's also on screen, of the Trade Policy Research Forum. We've been going for a few years now. Our objective, as you can tell by the logo, is to build bridges. So we want to build a bridge between research and policy, between research and practice, and among the various parts of the trade policy community, thinking of economists, lawyers, political scientists, policy professionals, and practitioners. So we hold a webinar approximately once a month that's dedicated to a research topic or a current topic in trade policy, where we host a discussion. We have a LinkedIn group that is active. It's a great place to post working papers or blogs, commentary, so that you can have comments and people's thoughts on that. We have a website, www.tprforum.org, where you can access all of our past webinars, both recordings and slides, and it gives instructions to sign up to our mailing list so that you can stay informed of what we're doing. Hannah, anything you want to add?
Yes, thank you so much, Ben. I'm super excited about the webinar today. Actually, people more than I am. Actually, it's the first time that somebody has been posting things in the group beforehand. So John Miller, he was so excited about this, so he actually pulled up some data on from Trade Data Monitor on the trade of electrical vehicles. So I think that's a really cool progression here in the TPR forum. Also, as always, we would like to thank Ricardo Ashby and Rabiul Islam for helping us out. As you might know, this is all done on a volunteer basis. And we have people from all over the world helping us out. So speaking of all over the world, why don't people just start putting, greeting us in the chat box, or so that we know where you're coming in from? Because then you've warmed it up so that once the question gets going, you know where to go, because we always run out of time. And so also super important, because we always get this question because people panic. Hey, is this going to be recorded? Are you going to post this? Yes, we are. We will post the recording. We will post Michael's presentation on the website. And so you can just follow along. Also, both Michaels are open to having conversations after. So you can reach out for any questions, and please keep the conversation going within the TPR forum LinkedIn group. Because we love seeing what's going on there. And there's so many of our old friends that we're seeing in the group here today. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to Michael Ferrantino, our esteemed advisor. Take it, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. So today's topic is very timely. That we're going to be talking about electric vehicles, and this is one of these interesting topics that has a trade policy aspect, it has an industrial policy aspect, and of course it has an environmental aspect. And today's presentation, I think, is going to lean into the trade policy aspect, but who knows where the discussion may take us. And so from there, I'm just going to give it to Michael Gasiorek.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Michael, Hannah, and Ben. So let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Michael Gasiorek. I'm Professor of Economics at the University of Sussex in Brighton on the south coast of the UK. And I'm director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory and also the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy. So just to give you a tiny little bit of background on that. So the UK Trade Policy Observatory was established the day after the referendum that the UK held to leave the EU in June 2016, literally. And one of the reasons we established the observatory, and it was the brainchild of my predecessor as director, which is Alan Winters, was precisely picking up on something that Ben said as a bridge between research and policy. In particular, before June 2016, the UK trade policy team probably had about 10 people in it, probably less. Department for Business and Trade now has over 3,000 people in it. We simply did not have capacity. And so part of the objective of doing the UK Trade Policy Observatory was we were academics with lots and lots of experience in trade, and we wanted to bridge between what we knew as inverted commas experts, I hesitate to use that term, to do that bridge between research and policy. The UK TPO then, together with other universities in the UK, established the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy. So the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy is a broader conglomerate of universities in the UK from all of the devolved nations working on trade policy, not just for the UK, but in part for the UK. Again, it's lots of academic research and lots of engagement. So that kind of gives you a bit of background. Now what I need to do is share my slides. Okay. So can somebody confirm for me that you can see my slides? Perfect. So once again, picking up on Ben's sort of theme or comment on bridges between research and policy. One of the interesting questions is, how do you make that bridge? And one of the ways you make that bridge is by trying to write things that are both timely and accessible. Because no policymaker is going to, apologies for this, but almost no policymaker, frankly, is going to read your 50-page working paper with lots of equations, lots of regressions and tables at the end. You have to find different ways of engaging with policymakers if you want to make that bridge. So one of the ways we do that bridge is when something timely comes along, we might write a blog on it or write a briefing paper, which is, think of that as an extended blog. You know, the way I like to think of it, a blog is one idea. In a briefing paper, you can have more than one idea, but don't have too many ideas. So when the US administration announced tariffs on EVs in May of this year, we immediately thought, this is quite interesting. Let's think about this a little bit. Is there something interesting to write? So together with my co-author on this, who you can see on the slide, Yanis Papadakis, who's a postdoctoral research fellow of the CITP here at Sussex, we decided to write a blog on this. Yanis, I assume that you are online. If you wanted to come in at any point, all you need to do is raise your hand and Ben will unmute your microphone so that you can come in as well. So feel free to come in at any point, Yanis. So we decided to look at this issue of EVs and tariffs on EVs, and then as a result of that wrote this blog, which is what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. So let me move on to the substance of the presentation. Electric vehicles are talked about a lot in the press by policymakers. There's lots and lots of discussion of them, and I think there are several reasons for this. As Hannah says, it's kind of on the interface of trade policy and industrial policy and so on. The car industry has been an important part of many developed countries' industrial base for many years, and EVs are a transition towards that. So it speaks to industrial policy, but clearly also speaks to the objectives of climate change and the green transition. So it's very, very topical and clearly very, very important. So by introduction, on May 14th, 2014, the US administration announced an increase on tariffs on imports on China on a range of products. We tend to only hear in the press about the electric vehicle tariffs, and you can see those, they're the third ones down, and the largest increase was on electric vehicles. But in fact, tariffs were introduced on quite a wide range of products, ranging from steel and aluminium at the top, ship-to-shore cranes and medical products at the bottom. So there was quite a range of tariffs that were being introduced. And the objective, or supposed objective, was protecting US industry and American, brackets, good jobs in the face of supposed unfair Chinese trade practices. Just want to explore that a little bit more. So specifically in the White House announcement, the fact sheet that was posted on May 14th, the overall aim of all these tariffs was to support investments and create good jobs, whatever that means, in key sectors that are vital for America's future and national security. So this is about investment, it's about jobs, it's about protection, it's also about national security. You know, national security as a justification for intervention in both industrial and trade policy, as many of you on this webinar will know, is becoming increasingly important. And then specifically in the subsection on electric vehicles, you see that with extensive subsidies and non-market practices, slap wrists, leading to substantial risks of overcapacity, we've seen a big increase in Chinese exports, jeopardizing productive investments elsewhere, and therefore this 100% tariff on EVs will protect American manufacturers from Chinese or from China's unfair trade practices, and that this action advances Biden's vision of ensuring the future of the auto industry will be made in America by American workers. So we decided we want to look into this a little bit, and I spoke to a colleague of mine, not here actually at the UK TPO, but somebody I know who's a real car industry buff and industry expert about this. And to my surprise, because I didn't know this at the time, I should hold my hand up here. I'm not an EV or car industry expert at all. I'm a trade geek, but not an EV geek. Let's put it that way. To my surprise, he said, but China doesn't export to the US at all. It's zero. Okay? So why are they introducing these tariffs? Now, it turns out he wasn't entirely correct, because China does export a bit to the US, but not very much. And so that led us to think we really need to consider carefully what the rationale is behind this tariff and the implications. So let me give you a few charts, a few visualizations. This gives you in 2023, the bar charts give you the top 10 EV exporters in the world. So these are exports to the world. Who are the main exporters? What you see is the market is very much dominated by Germany and China, by far the biggest blue bars. Then you've got a bunch of smaller exports, quite a few EU countries in there, plus Japan and the US. The red dots give you the normalized revealed comparative advantage, again in 2023, for each of these countries. Those of you familiar with a normalized revealed comparative advantage, it's really easy. It ranges between -1 and 1. So if the normalized revealed comparative advantage is positive, that means you have a revealed comparative advantage in this product. If it's negative, you do not. And what you see that 3 of the top exporters appear not to have a revealed comparative advantage in electric vehicles. Out of those 3, it's interesting, for both the US and France, their revealed comparative advantage appears to be significantly declining, whereas for Italy, it's actually sort of rising over time. So, you know, the normalized RCA doesn't tell you the direction of travel, it just tells you where you are in 2023. Next chart. These are the EV exports by the top 5 of these countries. So Germany, China, Belgium, Japan, and the US. And it just shows you the value of exports over time. 2 things which I think are striking or interesting about this figure. One is the dramatic rise in exports by both China and Germany. I alluded to the increase in China's exports earlier when I said there was a 70% increase from 2020 onwards. You see that here, ditto for Germany. The other interesting line here is that for the US, where you see not much change over time, and if anything, since 2019, a bit of a decline in EV exports. So, to preview what we find in this blog, or what we argued in this blog, we know that Chinese exports increased dramatically. We know that US imports of EVs increased dramatically also since 2020, as it happens, by 10 times. But what's interesting is that they did not increase from China. Okay? China is barely supplies, exports from China barely supply anything to the US market. In contrast, EU imports of EVs have also increased dramatically, but with a rising and substantial share of imports from China. So that led us to think that the US tariff rise can either be seen as some form of preemptive move, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, to raise entry barriers in the US EV market, or it's actually more of a political move, some form of promise to US citizens, threat to China, and is not actually intended to have much economic impact. And clearly all of this will have implications on this sort of tension or trade-off between competitiveness and the green transition. So back to policy motivation. So once again, you see in the blue line here, US exports of EVs. Now I've added in imports as well. So you see this slight decline since 2019 of US exports of EVs and a big growing trade deficit in EVs. And this is due to a rapid rise in those imported EVs and what appears to be a loss of US competitiveness. And when I looked at those normalized revealed comparative advantages, and if you look at those over time, again, you see a decline, at least according to those indicators, in US competitiveness. So one candidate cause as to what's driving this change is Chinese EVs. Is it Chinese EVs that are crowding out US producers? And the short answer, which I gave you earlier, is no. So this chart gives you the share of EV imports in each country's total imports, so share of EV imports from China in each country's total imports. And you see that imports from the US, in the US from China are a tiny, tiny fraction of US imports. In contrast, I've got both the UK and the EU here, although I'm not really going to say very much about the UK. China accounts for close to 50% of EU imports of electric vehicles. So while the US imported less than 400 million in 2023, and those are declining now as well, because as far as I know, most of these were probably Polestars, and production of Polestars is switching away from China into the US. So while the US imported very little, the EU imported $10.5 billion worth and the UK $4.6 billion worth. So substantial amounts in comparison to the US. So who does export EVs to the US? Well, it turns out to be many of the countries, which I indicated earlier as being the top exporters of EVs: Germany, Korea, Mexico, for obvious reasons, Japan, Belgium, and so on. And China, very, very little. The observant among you may have noticed that in my earlier chart, there is a country missing as a top exporter of EVs. And almost certainly it would be the third country, and that is Korea. And this just reflects, I took 2023 data from Comtrade, and Comtrade has no EV exports for Korea for 2023. If I'd had a bit more time, I might have taken an average or done some, charts over time. But actually, Korea should also be in there. And you see that here when you look at the top exporters to the US, and Korea is indeed one of those top exporters. Okay. So back to sort of discussion and sort of possible explanations and so on. For the US, I think explanation for the tariffs, to my mind, there are two possibilities. One is that these are preemptive tariffs, that the tariff really is there to protect the EV industry, but in a preemptive fashion. And if so, that struck me at the time, and it still strikes me as being highly unusual. And it also raises questions regarding WTO legality. Now, whether the US administration cares about WTO legality is another question, but it does raise questions. A country can levy duties in the face of a sudden surge of imports, for example, under WTO rules, but not in a preemptive sense. So if it is there to protect the EV industry from a future surge of imports of Chinese EVs, then it's highly unusual. One of the reasons that apparently China exports very little EVs to the US, and I don't think this was in the blog, and again, this is from chatting to industry experts or talking to industry experts, about this is that China doesn't produce the type of cars that America wants, EVs. Essentially, they're too small. China is really, really good at small, in inverted commas, economical, efficient electric vehicles, but that's not really what the American market wants, apparently. Okay. So back to the notion of preemptiveness. If it is preemptive, it also raises questions as to whether that would ever even be effective. And we know there's a bit of a literature on the effectiveness of, for example, Trump/Biden tariffs. I shouldn't just call them Trump tariffs because Biden has by and large continued that tariff policy, on whether tariffs have had much positive employment effects and so on. And there's also the issue that raising tariffs on intermediate inputs, and we saw earlier that actually the tariffs were being raised across a wide range of products, including steel and aluminium, might reduce American competitiveness. So the alternative explanation is that this has got very little to do with economics. Actually, this is political. And there's a cynical version of that story, which is that there is some, again, empirical evidence that Trump's trade war contributed to support for Republicans in the last elections. And with an upcoming election, the current administration wants to be seen as protecting US jobs. The slightly more generous, more broadly political explanation, although it does tie into the preemptive explanation, is that there are genuine concerns amongst policymakers in the administration about the interface between industrial policy, competitiveness, and unfair trade practices, and the need to respond to that. Is the US alone? No. So the EU announced, and this started, I think, on the 4th of July, that the EU will also implement tariffs on electric vehicles on China, but these are in the form of countervailing duties. In other words, what the EU undertook an investigation and ended up concluding that Chinese car producers were getting unfair subsidies, were being subsidized, that gave them an unfair competitive advantage, and it's decided to introduce a range of countervailing duties, ranging from 17 to 38%. A couple of things that I think are quite interesting about that 17 to 38%. The first is the range. Why is it just not one figure? Why do we have this range, 17 to 38%? I'll explain that in a moment. The second is these are considerably lower than the tariffs introduced by the US administration, which are at 100%. And as they'll be on top of an existing 10% duty, the peak tariff is 48%. So the reason that you get this range of tariffs, and again, I think this is an unusual feature of this policy, not entirely clear to me either, but I'm not a lawyer, whether this is WTO compatible or legal, but I think it possibly is that these tariffs are being applied on a company-specific basis. So the 17% tariff is being applied to BYD, the 38% tariff on a company, which I think is SAIC, if I remember correctly. And that's in part tailored to the level of subsidies allegedly received by Chinese firms, but also tailored according to the degree of cooperation in providing the EU Commission with information provided by Chinese firms. Essentially, the more you cooperate and tell us what sort of subsidies you've had, maybe the lower tariff we will levy on you. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that, as far as I know, most independent observers seem to think that the competitiveness of China is sufficiently high that even with a tariff of about 30 or 40%, they will probably still be competitive in the EU market. The price at which, for example, BYD sells its cars in China is much, much lower than it is currently being sold with just a 10% tariff in the EU. So that's more or less where we are on this blog and on this presentation, but let me just reflect 2 more slides with a couple of reflections. Both the US and the EU policy on electric vehicles reflect several concerns, and we saw that in some of those quotations that I gave you at the beginning. It's about economic security, it's about industrial strategy and jobs or good jobs. It's also about the environment and climate. So there's a mix of motives driving these things. Now, for those of you that are economists on this call, and I'm an economist, so I'll put this as if from my perspective. As economists, we're quite used to simplifying. I mean, that's our bread and butter. Let's make extreme assumptions and follow the consequences of those extreme assumptions and trying to work out our models. So we tend to think of the objectives of government policy as being either efficiency or equity. What's the most efficient way of doing things? That might be an argument for intervention, or you want to achieve more equitable outcomes. And then government intervention is justified in the presence of market failures. And we're also taught and believe that effective policy is the one where the instrument targets the distortion as directly as possible. And, you know, when I was an undergraduate, that's what I was taught, these core objectives or trade-offs between efficiency and equity. I think we've got a third objective now, which you could say is part of efficiency, but actually I think it's different. Increasingly, we have a clear third objective for government intervention, which is economic security, which comes with a reduced belief in the efficiency of markets and serious concerns about unfair practices of others. And that gives us some quite difficult trade-offs arising from our policy choices. So you slap a tariff on imports of EVs, that might, in inverted commas, help domestic producers in some sense, or help domestic workers in some sense. Might. I see Hannah sort of shrugging her shoulders on this. But equally, it might impact negatively on your climate change objectives. So, as I've just said, US and EU tariffs might help domestic producers, but might impact negatively on environmental climate change objectives. So I guess as a sort of an academic engaged in trying to bridge that gap between research and policy, I think it's really important that policymakers, as well as ourselves as academics, are clear about what the real objectives of policy are. The trouble is it's getting hard, in some circumstances, it's getting harder to work out. You know, are these US tariffs preemptive, economically motivated, or are they politically motivated? What are the real objectives of policy, and to target policy accordingly? Don't forget the Tinbergen rule. You need as many instruments as you have policy objectives. Final comment, it is also important, and I haven't said anything really about this, but to recognize the global nature of the car industry. That sounds kind of self-evident, but I mean a couple of things by this, or two things. One is what we're increasingly finding, and this is more than I think the general arguments about nearshoring and friendshoring that are taking place, but that in the car industry, production and sales tend to be regionally co-located. If you're selling in the EU, you tend to produce in the EU. If you're selling in North America, you tend to produce in North America. And then there are interesting questions, which I haven't discussed much about. It doesn't matter, do we care about, the concern, let me put that slightly different, the concern about Chinese competitiveness in electric vehicles. Are we worried about Chinese competitiveness in terms of where the production takes place or who does the production? So BYD, for example, already has several very substantial investment plans into the EU, I believe into Hungary and into Spain. So we will have very strong competitiveness of Chinese branded cars in the EU and the UK in the years to come. They won't necessarily come from China. They might come from Hungary or Spain. And on that note, I've probably overrun in time. Well, not by much. I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Michael. And so, yeah, I think that you've set up the interesting aspects of this topic, or at least many of the interesting aspects of this, very well. And so each of us organizers is going to begin with asking you a question. And before I ask mine, I just wanted to note that by my understanding, it is not unusual for either countervailing duties or anti-dumping duties to be administered on a firm-specific basis. So I think that is WTO legal. I was going to ask you about the WTO aspects of this, but after listening to your full presentation, I think I want to ask you about the supply chain aspects of this and how they relate to the policymaker really, having decided what their objectives are. There's a very interesting paper that came out of the USITC recently by a team led by Jing Yuan and David Coffin, where they did some CG modeling of the hypothetical multilateral tariffs imposed both on Chinese EVs and on parts for EVs. And you notice that the US policy goes after the parts and the vehicles themselves. But if you don't think about this in terms of supply chains or in terms of general equilibrium, then there are unintended consequences that can happen. So if I look at the actual US policy, which imposes duties both on vehicles and on components of Chinese origin, there's nothing stopping Chinese firms from sending lots and lots of vehicle components to Germany and Korea and Mexico, and having those assembled into vehicles in those countries, which are then imported into the United States without any additional duties. And so my question for you is, should policymakers be concerned about that outcome, and how should their objectives in formulating the policy guide them in deciding whether to be concerned and what to do about it?
Okay, shall I take each question at a time? So answer that one first. Yeah, okay, great question, Michael. Yes, policymakers should be concerned about the unintended consequences, as it were, of their actions, and about how there may be diversionary effects of policies undertaken. I think one of the classic examples of this, if I remember correctly, were the tariffs that were introduced in the late noughties or early sort of 2010s, 11s, that US imposed. I think it was on washing machines from China. Essentially what happened was that production shifted to Vietnam and Malaysia, I think, and then that's where those imports then subsequently came from. So companies tend to be quite agile, depends a little bit on the industry, and will respond. And clearly, in a world of complex supply chains, there are various ways that companies can respond, Chinese companies or other companies, to those policies being introduced. So the other possible unintended consequence, which I think the US administration is also concerned and worried about, is that Chinese production will shift to Mexico, and then they will start shipping the goods from Mexico under the USMCA to the US. Now, what the US has also done is try to make those sorts of actions more difficult through some of the provisions in the IRA, which are very much focused on trying to encourage the as I understand it, very much focused on trying to encourage the emergence of the electrical vehicle industry in the US. And of the new investments that have come in since, I think, the announcement of the IRA, about 40% of those are focused on the electrical vehicle industry. But so one of the ways that the policy is trying to deal with that kind of problem is to make the rules of origin requirements more and more stringent, both on the final component, but also on the battery component. Nevertheless, companies will find ways, if it is profitable to do so, around some of those restrictions. The other supply chain consideration, which I think really needs to be borne in mind, not just for the US, but also for other countries such as the EU introducing such policies, or hypothetically, for a new government in the UK, what should it be doing in this space? Canada is also, for example, talking about possibly introducing tariffs on electric vehicles. What should the UK do? Should we be following the same sort of policy or not? Sorry, I diverged a little bit there into the UK. I was going to say that the other issue is the impact of raising tariffs on your intermediate inputs is likely to make you and your producers less competitive in your export markets. And that may be an unintended consequence of your actions. And the final thing I would say on this that you might expect there to be is retaliation, but from China. And that is likely to impact on your domestic producers, your jobs, your workers. Now, it's unclear what that retaliation will be with regard to the EU action. China has announced that it's initiating an investigation into this, then it's due to, I think, report in January of this year. But it's hard to believe that there will not be some form of retaliation. Now, who are the big car producers in the EU? Well, you might think of BMW. I think approximately a third of BMW's profits come from its sales in China. So retaliation in some form or another could, of course, then impact on your firms and is another possible unintended consequence. I should add to that statistics that I just gave about BMW is that most of that actually comes from BMW's production in China. So these are not exports from, let's say, Germany to China, it's production within China, but even that could well be affected by changes in Chinese policy.
Thanks. So this is all more complex than we thought. Hannah, let's give you a swing at this.
All right, I'm going to leave. So there's some really interesting questions coming in from the forum too. So I'm going to leave that to Ben so that he can summarize that. And I'm going to take us a little bit to the other side of things, because one of the things, like the bridge that we're trying to bridge here, the gap that we're trying to bridge here, very much has to do with policy that is evidence-based. And that may or may not be the case in this particular question, which Michael has alluded to. And it may also be that we're moving away from that in general, in terms of policy, at least on the other side of the Atlantic, going on right now. But my question is because there are a lot of people here who want it to be that way. I don't know if you, so if you saw this on social media, one of our other advisors is a general director for the Swedish National Board of Trade. And there was a big organization here, or there was a big thing here in Sweden where everybody was gathered, and he had a baseball cap that said, make trade policy research based again. Which I thought was really fun. But my question to you, Michael, is what sort of research do you think that people should be looking at, and what, if any, of that do you think can move the needle back to policymaking being research based again?
That's a very generic question. I assume you mean not just in this space, but sort of in the trade space.
Well, I think this is sort of a projection of what might come in other areas. So it's general, but also specific.
Gosh, that's quite a broad question. Let me give you a few thoughts on this.
Yes,
One
please.
of the things that I have learned a lot, in particular, since the referendum, since we established the UK TPO, in terms of evidence-based research, in particular in this sort of space and field, is that you often need both legal knowledge and economic knowledge. So evidence-based policy that draws upon legal expertise and economic expertise is, I think, extremely valuable. And we kind of have alluded to some of this in thinking about WTO legality of these issues and so on, what that means for policymakers and the advice one might want to give policymakers. Now let me jump in a completely different direction. One of my particular bugbears, and this is I accept this is UK specific, okay, but it's not Brexit specific, but it is UK specific, is I think there's a tremendous amount more that can be learned about how firms and the people that work for them, employees, are affected by changes in trade policy by looking at microdata, firm level data. We kind of know what we can do with the Comtrade data, with the national trade statistics at the detail 6 and 8 level, and there's a tremendous amount that we can do on what has been the impact of, you know, various forms of shocks or trade policy change and so on. I think there's an awful lot we still don't understand about how firms respond, how different types of firms respond in particular, and then the jobs that are associated with those firms and so on. And why this is a bugbear of mine is that certainly under the previous administration, which was, you know, now 10 days ago, getting access to firm level trade data in the UK was astonishingly difficult. That data is held by the HMRC. Between 2017 and 2022, there were 30 official requests for access to that data by research organizations such as ourselves or universities. 27 of those requests were refused. I know that devolved administrations and even Whitehall departments are not being given access to that data because they don't have the correct legal gateway. And if you don't give researchers access to the right sort of data, then it's really hard to do good, you know, to have evidence-based policy making. So that's my bugbear. I should get off my soapbox.
No, you should be on it more often. That's ludicrous. And I should also tell people on the call here. So Professor Ari Koko is on the call, and he's the one who's taught me all I know about firm level data. And there's also Chenji here, who is from the Canadian Government Affairs and the Chief Economist unit there. So some really interesting people on the call today that we could ask more. But thank you. That was a really good answer to my question, Ben.
Yeah, let me jump in. So, great presentation, Michael. I learned a lot from that. So thank you very much. There's a couple of questions that I wanted to pull out from the chat. So I'm going to combine a couple of things into one, if that's okay. You know, one is following up on Hannah's question. You know, I like your answer about firm level data. I think that is really crucial. Access to it depends a lot on where you're sitting and you know, which country you're dealing with. But we had a question in the chat as to, you know, how far we can actually push trade data like Comtrade. Are there sources out there where someone has gone through and done the hard work of saying, you know, these are the 50 6-digit products that are part of the EV supply chain. These are the products that are part of the lithium ion battery supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. Are there any sources like that that you can point people to, or is that an area where we still sort of need to make a start?
Great question. Short answer is I haven't got a clue.
Okay.
But I would love to know if anybody else who's on this call knows of work that has been done along these lines. I'd be really, really interested. I think I have noticed that there are some people, at least one person from the OECD on this call, and I think the OECD have done a lot of work in the sort of supply chain resilience space and so on. So I'd love to know if the OECD have any work on this, if anybody else does. You know, if there is work like that out there, I would love to know about it, but I don't know.
Yeah, so I can see we've actually got a couple of responses coming up in chat. So there's a suggestion that the IEA has done some work. I feel like the IMF had a thing on low carbon supply chains at one point, so that might. And I'm seeing a suggestion that a colleague and friend, Anirudh Shingle, has done it for India. So there is probably some work out there. Anyway, it sounds like that's an open question. So to go and look at those sources, I think would be a really good outcome. The second thing I wanted to follow up on is just taking a few questions out of the chat. You know, you mentioned this possibility of diversion that you get when you impose tariffs on a particular market. Are we seeing any evidence of that already? So we had a couple of people asking about the numbers for Belgium, for example. Is that reflecting production that's taking place in Belgium, or is that reflecting transshipment and all that kind of good stuff? Same question for Mexico.
Again, I'm afraid I'm going to say that I don't know at this point. I think it's a really, really good question. It's probably pretty early days to be seeing any, you know, I would say it's far, I wouldn't expect to see any diversion yet of that sort. But, you know, Possibly one would expect that to take place, but I honestly don't know. But it's a great question. It's certainly something that people will be looking into. Now that these tariffs are being imposed, will give us plenty of scope for future research, but we don't know yet.
Absolutely. No, good call. And, as Hannah said, part of the rationale of having a group like this one is to come up with ideas that, we often have a lot of PhD students, graduate students on the call. So if you're out there and this is an interesting topic, then those are a couple of areas that you might be able to look at. Michael Ferrantino, shall I hand back to you?
Can I just add one more thing to your question, Ben? You said, how far can we take trade data? Let me give you another example, which kind of picks, and that's why I ended up thinking of it, picks up on your question about transshipment and Belgium and so on. Again, this is not to do with electric vehicles, okay? So if you look at UK trade with the EU, post the introduction of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, by and large, exports have recovered, okay? Relative, if you compare EU to non-EU. What's really interesting, however, and this is using trade data, is that if you look at the varieties traded, so a car exported from the UK to France, an electric vehicle, is, let's say, different to one exported to Belgium or to Malta. So each product destination is a different variety. Consistently, since the introduction of the TCA up until the end of 2023, trade in varieties has collapsed by about 40%. So UK exports about 40% less varieties. That could be because it's a whole bunch of small firms who are no longer exporting to the EU. They just decided those fixed costs of dealing with the bureaucracy, VAT returns, having a VAT return is too much. It could easily be that. It could easily be that firms are shipping to a distributor in the Netherlands and now shipping out to a whole bunch of countries. So they're changing the way they trade as opposed to that they are not trading anymore. You can't know that from the aggregate trade data, from the sort of even the 6-digit or 8-digit trade data. You can only know that from looking at firm level trade data.
Absolutely.
Right. So, okay, yeah. We actually have a good 13 minutes left, and yes, I see that the chat is blowing up with suggestions of how you can find your EC supply chain, concordance. Thanks, Prem Kowalski. I'm going to also post another paper to the forum that I referred to before that also bears on this. Michael Gasiorek, I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. When I first read your blog and wanted to invite you on this, I was just taken by the statement that the legal justification for the Biden tariffs, the new ones, is not clear in WTO terms. That it's odd to have a safeguard which is preemptive and probably unprecedented. And I was thinking that this is actually a kind of a charming question because it sort of refers to the period before 2018. Now that the United States has blown up the dispute settlement mechanism, we sort of live in an age which is prior to that. And if somebody in the world doesn't like, let's say, what the United States has done or what the EU has done, then it seems to me that in the current environment, you have three courses of action. The first is to simply retaliate tit for tat on your own motion against the thing that the US or EU has done that you don't like. The second is to negotiate with the US or EU and try to talk them out of it. And the third is to just suck it up. And I note that China in particular does not seem keen to retaliate against the current tariffs, the new tariffs, as they would have during the Trump years. So I'd just like your views on, simply as, yeah, as a practical matter of other countries reacting to this, how do you suppose this might all play out?
Another easy question. Thank you, Michael. So let me just pick up on one of the first things you said about the WTO legality, which isn't really your final question, but I'll just pick up on that now. If you go back to one of my early slides as to what the supposed American justification for this was, quite clearly part of that motivation was to protect America's national security. So my guess is if this ever were to go sort of down the WTO legality route, it would be the national security exemption that would be raised as the justification, not the countervailing duties, because I think, I don't know, I'm not a WTO legal scholar, but I don't imagine that preemptive countervailing duties are remotely WTO compatible. I'd be very, very surprised. Then back to your sort of, as it were, final question, where your question ended up about how this will play out. Honestly, one doesn't know. It's complicated. I think that American policy appears to be very much to try and isolate China as much as possible. And one would expect that were there to be a future Trump presidency, that will be accentuated even further. I think EU policy is more nuanced. So they haven't raised tariffs to the same degree. Neither have they raised them to the degree that would necessarily make Chinese producers uncompetitive in the EU market. And I'm sure that part of that is because of the importance of EU supply chains and EU trading relationships with China. Let's not forget that America is a far less open economy than the EU or many other economies, simply because it is so big. So trade is not so important to China, to the US, as it is for many other countries. I can't remember what the stats are, but I think American openness is about 25% if you're measuring it as exports plus imports as a share of GDP. But for the UK at the moment, as by way of contrast, it's around 70%. So trade matters a lot more. You went through 3 possible responses. I think there is a 4th possible response. I think there is a 4th response, but it's not entirely clear quite how to operationalize it in terms of the fora through which this could be done, which is to work closely with like-minded countries to build alliances, and that would probably be thematically across areas. It might be technology, it might be digital trade, it might be supply chain, it might be critical minerals and so on. And I'm thinking about the smaller players. By smaller, I mean smaller than China, EU, and US. So this is about working with countries such as Japan, Korea, Canada, Australia, and to build alliances across policy areas to try and constrain some of the actions taken by the bigger players. There have been some calls, for example, in the UK as to, well, how should we respond to Chinese supposed unfair practice or subsidies of electric vehicles? One response is, great, we get cheap EVs, that helps our transition. We are not going to have a big, huge successful EV industry probably in the UK. So is there really even a need to respond? And again, that also goes back to what I was saying towards the end of my presentation, which is you've got multiple objectives here. You do have objectives of domestic production, domestic innovation, domestic jobs, but you've also got the green transition. That you don't want policy to harm the green transition. That doesn't make policy making easier. I don't know if that quite answered your question, Michael, but it's the best I could do.
No, thanks. That's good.
Ben, do you want to take a?
Oh,
No, I
I
was
can.
just going to say, if we could use Ben's superpowers, he's so great at summarizing questions that are coming in and just tying them all together. So I was going to ask you to do that.
Well, I'm going to do something slightly different. So one, when we talk about bridging the gap with all the different disciplines in trade policy, one that we don't often talk about is history. And listening to the presentation, it actually took me back to when I was doing graduate school in international relations, which unfortunately was 25 years ago. And the people that I was learning from had, as a very recent memory, US car tariffs against Japan and big strategic trade policy fights over things like memory chips. So to keep it in the car example, what can we learn from that experience? That was for people who don't know about it, this was in kind of the 80s and 90s. A relatively free trade US administration nonetheless imposed a lot of duties on imports coming from Japan due to a competitive threat. And the result was that the Japanese car industry established manufacturing facilities in the south of the United States. So, Michael, my question to you, what do we learn from that? Is there, is history kind of rhyming in this sense, or are we seeing dynamics that are quite different in the current dispute?
I think what we learn from that is that policy, it's very easy to criticize policymakers, right? But that policy can sometimes have positive, intervention can sometimes have positive consequences. I strongly suspect, I don't know this for sure, but it's what I'm kind of being told. One of the reasons that BYDs, for example, investing in Hungary and thinking about investing in Spain is partly in anticipation of these sorts of policy responses by the EU, this levying of tariffs and so on. So it is partly in response to those sorts of policy actions. So policy can engender the sorts of responses that we want. In this case, invest, or for the EU's, from the EU's perspective, investment into the EU. But at other times, it doesn't. So similarly, going back probably now to the late 70s, early 80s, the EU introduced what are now, of course, banned in the WTO, voluntary export restraints on Japanese exports of various types of cars into the EU. Did Japanese imports fall? To my knowledge, no, they didn't. What happened was the Japanese moved into higher end models. Right? So again, unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on. Maybe one that I would add is how we think of the counterfactual as well. So I think when people here in the I'm in the US, the accent doesn't give it away, but I'm sitting in New York. When people think about the previous round of car tariffs here, they often think that it was a bit of a win because we got the manufacturing capacity, jobs in relatively underserved areas, that sort of thing. But of course, the counterfactual also asks the question of what happened to consumers during that time. And the reality is that they paid more than they needed to for vehicles. And I think a couple of the questions that came up in the chat really get to this point in the environmental context. It's not just a consumer surplus problem, it's an externality problem. We are going to have a slower transition than we otherwise would if we make electric vehicles more expensive by using tariffs and all these sorts of things. So I liked your point there that, one possible response that we have is to say, okay, someone's subsidizing electric vehicle production. We want to roll out electric vehicles as soon as possible. So it is actually, a choice that we could make to just not respond to it, to take the win on an environmental basis. So I'm just going to leave it there. I think that was a really rich presentation. It's a great example of the sort of research that we like to showcase here. I think, you talked as well about bridging the gap. I think it's a really perfect example of that. So going to the data, trying to learn what we can, thinking through it in a rigorous and detailed manner, and then turning that into a set of really useful policy questions and conclusions. So, Michael, thank you for sharing that with us. We really appreciate your time. Again, we will be posting a recording and also your slides on the website in coming days. let me do a quick pitch, as we always do for our next webinar. We're taking August off in the very best Northern Hemisphere tradition. We will be back in September, and on September 26th at 9 a.m. New York time, that's back to our usual Thursday, we'll be talking about geopolitical fragmentation and trade. So Benedict Hyde from the University of Adelaide will be joining us to present on that. Kind of follows on from what we're talking about today. I think there's a big geopolitical aspect in these tariffs. I mean, Michael was mentioning the national security aspect. So we'll be following up on that. I hope everyone has a nice break if you are having one over August. Again, thank you, Michael Gasiorek. Thank you, Michael Ferrantino, for setting up the session and chairing it so well. People are asking me what the website is. It's www.tprforum.org. So thanks to everyone, and we'll see you back here in September.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. And as always, we're open to suggestions.